The Celestial Nexus Academy floated in the neutral zone between 6 major galactic territories, a monument to cooperation, enlightenment, and the occasionally delusional belief that putting thousands of young aliens in one place would somehow produce anything other than chaos. Founded approximately 12,000 standard cycles ago, the institution prided itself on accepting only the finest minds from across known space, which was a diplomatic way of saying they let in anyone whose government could afford the tuition and whose species hadn't been banned for eating the furniture. The Academy's central spire housed the Advanced Theoretical Sciences Department, where the galaxy's future astrophysicists, quantum engineers, and reality-bending mathematicians gathered to solve the universe's greatest mysteries. Or, more accurately, to argue about solving them, while the professors desperately tried to prevent interspecies incidents that might trigger diplomatic crises. Class assignments at the Nexus followed a peculiar bit of bureaucratic logic that somehow made sense to administrators who probably hadn't set foot in an actual classroom in decades. Students were grouped not by academic ability or even age, but by their homeworld's danger classification. The Galactic Concordat maintained an exhaustive database rating every inhabited world on a scale from Class 1 to Class 15, measuring factors like gravity, atmospheric toxicity, predator density, geological instability, and that always fun metric called probable mortality rate for unaugmented colonists. Class 1 worlds were garden paradises, where the most dangerous thing you might encounter was a particularly aggressive flower. Class 15 worlds were hellscapes, where the planet itself seemed to have a personal vendetta against the continued existence of life. Most species came from Class 3 to Class 7 worlds, comfortable middle-of-the-road environments, where evolution had been challenging enough to produce intelligence, but not so challenging that dinner might eat you first. The unspoken hierarchy was obvious to anyone with functioning sensory organs. Students from lower-class worlds looked down on those from higher-class worlds, operating under the theory that species from gentle environments were soft, naive, and probably couldn't survive a stiff breeze without filing a complaint with the galactic authorities. It was prejudice dressed up in academic robes, but at least it was egalitarian prejudice, equally distributed across species lines. Advanced Astrophysics 401 met 3 times per standard cycle in a lecture hall, designed by an architect who had apparently never seen students before and assumed they would sit still in assigned seats like decorative statuary. The current semester's cohort included 27 students from 14 different species, representing worlds rated Class 2 through Class 9. It was considered a nice, safe spread. No one from the really dangerous worlds. Until today. Velcrin of Thessia stood 8.2 feet tall when he bothered to fully extend his crystalline structure, which he did frequently because someone that tall doesn't accidentally grow that way without wanting people to notice. His species had evolved on a Class 2 world with gravity so gentle you could practically float between steps, an atmosphere so pure it made filtered water look contaminated, and an ecosystem that had eliminated predators approximately 40,000 years ago, when his ancestors decided nature was tacky and restructured the entire planet. Thessians were made of living silicon crystal matrices, their bodies semi-transparent and refracting light in ways that would make a prism jealous. They thought slowly by human standards, but with incredible depth and precision. Velcrin's ancestors had spent the last 100 generations in climate-controlled biodomes, studying theoretical physics, while automated systems handled everything from food production to waste management. His people hadn't had to survive anything more dangerous than a particularly challenging mathematical proof in recorded history. This had given Velcrin certain ideas about his place in the universe. Specifically, that it was somewhere near the top. He sat in the back row of the lecture hall, his crystalline form refracting the ambient light into calculated patterns that suggested deep thought but mostly just gave other students headaches. His academic record was impressive by any standard, top marks in quantum field theory, published 3 papers before his 4th solar cycle, and possessed the kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong about anything important, or at least, never having been wrong about anything important where someone was brave enough to correct him. Velcrin held certain opinions about species from higher-class worlds. He rarely spoke these opinions directly, being too sophisticated for such crude prejudice, but they colored every interaction like light through his crystalline structure. Species from dangerous worlds were survivors, certainly, but survival and intelligence were different things entirely. Any creature could evolve to run from predators or fight over resources. It took true civilization to transcend such primitive concerns and reach for higher understanding. He was about to receive a comprehensive education on the flaws in this reasoning. Professor Calix entered the lecture hall with the harried expression of someone who had just been informed of a schedule change 5 minutes ago and was still processing the implications. Calix belonged to a species that resembled a six-limbed starfish made of leather, and their body language broadcast anxiety across multiple appendages simultaneously. The class recognized this as unusual. Calix was normally unflappable, the sort of educator who could explain the mathematics of wormhole formation while 3 students argued about sports in the back row. Today, Calix looked like someone about to announce either a pop quiz or the end of the world, and the odds were about even. Before we begin, Calix's translator rendered their chemical speech patterns into Concordat standard. We have a new student joining us today. Due to scheduling conflicts in other sections, she's been transferred to our course. I expect everyone to extend the appropriate courtesy and cooperation. The way Calix emphasized appropriate suggested they were hoping for something closer to please don't cause an intergalactic incident, rather than actual courtesy. The door opened. She walked in like she had absolutely nowhere more important to be, and also like she could be literally anywhere else in 3 seconds if things got boring. Medium height by human standards, which put her at about 5.5 feet tall, making her shorter than most of the class. Dark hair pulled back in something that probably had a name more sophisticated than ponytail, but served the same purpose. She wore the Academy's standard bodysuit in dark gray, and carried a datapad under one arm with the casual grip of someone who had never considered the possibility of dropping it. What made 17 students suddenly very interested in their desks was the information packet that appeared on everyone's personal display. Transfer student. Species, human. Homeworld designation, Earth. Classification, Class 12 Deathworld. Class 12. There were only 47 Class 12 worlds in the entire Concordat database, and 30 of them were officially quarantined because the survey teams kept dying. Earth had only been granted membership in the Concordat 15 standard cycles ago, and the galaxy was still adjusting to the reality that humans existed and apparently had opinions about things. The reaction in the lecture hall split along predictable lines. Students from Class 6 and higher worlds went very still, operating on the sound evolutionary logic that not moving might prevent you from being identified as prey. Students from lower class worlds like Velcrin looked skeptical, because surely the danger classification was exaggerated. How dangerous could one small planet really be? The human surveyed the available seats with an expression that suggested she was calculating something, but in a very relaxed way. She chose a spot 3 rows from the front, middle section, equidistant from all exits. Several students suddenly remembered they had wanted to sit somewhere else and relocated. Excellent, Calix said with the tone of someone trying to convince themselves everything would be fine. Now, if we could all retrieve yesterday's assignment on gravitational lensing effects in binary star systems. I am called Velcrin of Thessia, daughter of Earth. His voice resonated through the hall with the subtle harmonics of his crystalline vocal structure, turned up just enough to sound impressive. He hadn't bothered with her actual name. I feel it necessary to inform you that this is an advanced theoretical course. The mathematics involved require certain cognitive prerequisites. The human turned in her seat with the fluid economy of motion that made 3 students flinch. She looked at Velcrin with an expression of mild interest, like he was a moderately complicated puzzle that might be fun to solve later if she had time. Appreciate the concern, she said. Her voice came out flat and unimpressed, with an accent that suggested English was her first language and Concordat standard something she'd picked up 3rd or 4th. I'll try to keep up. I merely wish to establish realistic expectations, Velcrin continued, warming to his subject. Species from higher classification worlds often struggle with abstract reasoning, being more adapted for immediate survival concerns rather than theoretical analysis. Several students made quiet noises that their translators rendered as various forms of "oh no." Professor Calix's appendages curled in what was definitely anxiety now. Perhaps we should return to the lesson plan. Here's some abstract reasoning for you, the human interrupted. You're 8 feet tall, made of something that probably shatters at the right resonant frequency, and you've lived your entire life at 0.6 standard gravity. I've walked around this station for 3 days at 0.95 standard, which means I'm currently operating under about twice the gravitational force your species considers normal, and I'm not even breathing hard. So before you start making assumptions about cognitive prerequisites, maybe consider that I've already done the math on exactly how many directions I could break you in half, and I'm choosing not to because I'm trying to be civilized here. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that happens when everyone in a room simultaneously realizes they're watching a disaster in progress and can't look away. Velcrin's crystalline structure shifted through 3 different colors in what members of his species would recognize as confusion transitioning to indignation. That is hardly appropriate academic discourse. Neither is your entire personality. But here we are. The human turned back toward the front of the class. Professor, you were saying something about binary star systems? Calix grabbed onto the lifeline with all 6 appendages. Yes, right, binary systems. Let's all focus on binary systems and definitely not on anything else currently happening in this classroom. The rest of the lecture proceeded with the kind of tension usually reserved for hostage negotiations. Velcrin radiated offended dignity from the back row. The human took notes with the casual focus of someone attending a moderately interesting presentation. Everyone else tried to pay attention to Calix's explanation of gravitational lensing, while also keeping at least one sensory organ pointed toward the Deathworlder, just in case. When Calix posed a question about calculating light distortion in overlapping gravitational fields, the human raised her hand with the same fluid motion she did everything else. Calix called on her with visible reluctance. Her answer was correct, comprehensive, and delivered in about 15 seconds, including a correction to one of the assumptions in Calix's original problem statement. It was the kind of response that would normally earn impressed nods, and maybe a few follow-up questions from other students eager to demonstrate their own understanding. Instead, everyone just stared. Velcrin's crystalline structure had shifted to a deep crimson that probably meant something specific in Thetian body language, but translated universally as, "I am having feelings about this situation, and none of them are good." That is, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the lecture hall, because he'd never learned to modulate for discretion, a simplistic interpretation that ignores several nuanced factors. Name one, the human said without turning around. The rotational dynamics of already accounted for in the 3rd variable. Next, the relativistic effects when approaching, included in the temporal distortion coefficient. Try again. Velcrin rose to his full height, which in 0.95 standard gravity required actual effort, but achieved the desired dramatic effect. You display a concerning level of confidence for someone who has been studying these concepts for what I assume is significantly less time than many others in this course. Now the human did turn around. Are you actually challenging my math, or are you just upset that the scary Deathworlder isn't sitting quietly in the back being grateful for your wisdom? I am suggesting, Velcrin said with the careful enunciation of someone trying very hard to maintain composure, that practical experience with violence does not necessarily translate to theoretical understanding of physics. And I'm suggesting, the human replied in exactly the same tone, that evolving in a biodome, where the most stressful thing your ancestors faced was deciding which flavor of synthesized nutrients to have for breakfast, doesn't necessarily translate to knowing what you're talking about either, but at least I'm not being smug about it. Perhaps. Velcrin's voice dropped to what his species considered a threatening register, which came across as slightly deeper harmonics to everyone else. You require a practical demonstration of why physical intimidation has no place in academic discourse. Perhaps. The human matched his tone perfectly. You should sit down before you learn exactly why my planet has a Class 12 rating, and yours has a Class 2. Professor Collix made a sound like a deflating balloon being strangled. Both of you. This is completely inappropriate. I formally invoke Academic Challenge Protocol, Velcrin announced, which caused Collix to make an even worse sound. If this human believes she can match theoretical understanding with aggressive posturing, let her prove her capabilities in the arena. The human blinked. The arena? The combat arena, another student whispered helpfully from 2 rows over. It's in the Academy Charter. Students can resolve disputes through physical contests. It's supposed to prevent violence by channeling it into controlled, "Oh, you want to fight?" The human said. Her expression suggested she'd just solved the puzzle and found it less interesting than expected. You actually want to fight me? You. I want to demonstrate, Velcrin corrected with immense dignity, that true superiority comes from intellect and civilization, not from evolving in a cesspool of violence. The human looked at Professor Collix. Is this allowed? Collix's appendages performed a gesture that translated roughly to "I cannot believe this is happening," but yes, technically. According to regulations written by administrators who clearly never anticipated this exact scenario, it is allowed, and I want it noted for the record that I advised against this. Cool, the human said. She looked back at Velcrin. When? Tomorrow. 1700 hours. Standard arena protocols. Works for me. She gathered her datapad. Professor, should I still do the homework, or is that going to be awkward after I'm done explaining practical physics to tall, crystalline, and confident back there? Please do the homework, Collix said weakly. Everyone please do the homework, and also please no one die before the next exam, because the paperwork is nightmare. The human left the lecture hall the same way she'd entered, with that comfortable economy of motion that suggested she could accelerate to terrifying speeds without warning, but chose not to because that would be rude. Half the class watched her go. The other half watched Velcrin, who was radiating colors that probably meant triumph in Thessian emotional language, but increasingly looked more like someone whistling past a graveyard. News traveled fast in a confined space station full of students with access to faster-than-light communication. By dinner, the entire academy knew about the challenge. By dessert, betting pools had formed across 17 different species' social networks. By the time evening study hours began, the odds were being calculated by actual mathematics students using probability models that factored in everything from gravitational adaptation to predator evolution patterns. The smart money was on the human. The desperate money was on Velcrin, mostly placed by other Thessians and a few students from Class 2 worlds who wanted to believe civilization counted for something. The really smart money was on the fight being stopped before serious injury occurred, but that betting pool was surprisingly small because nobody actually believed it. Velcrin spent the evening in the advanced training modules, reviewing combat techniques that his species had developed approximately 40,000 years ago and hadn't updated since, mainly because they hadn't needed them. The crystalline structural advantages were significant: hard to damage, naturally armored, capable of shifting body mass for optimal leverage. Against another Thessian or even most species from Class 2 through 5 worlds, he would have considerable advantages. Against a Deathworlder, he was bringing a abacus to a quantum computer fight, but he didn't know that yet. The human spent the evening in the library, finishing the homework assignment and 2 chapters ahead, because apparently being challenged to physical combat wasn't sufficient reason to fall behind in coursework. A few students who worked up the courage to approach found her completely willing to explain the math behind gravitational lensing, patient and clear in her explanations, showing no signs of stress about the upcoming fight. This should have been their first clue. The Academy's combat arena occupied a converted cargo bay in one of the lower sections, redesigned by the same optimistic administrators who thought structured violence would prevent unstructured violence. The space was roughly circular, 50 meters in diameter, with variable gravity controls, emergency medical stations at 4 corners, and seating for approximately 200 spectators. By 1700 hours, there were over 400 beings crammed into the available space, with another 1,000 watching via live feed from their quarters. The Academy administration had sent 3 officials to oversee the match, enforce the rules, and provide the paperwork trail that would be needed when somebody inevitably filed a formal complaint. Velcrin entered the arena from the east entrance, and credit where it was due, he made an impressive sight. 8 feet of crystalline structure catching the light in calculated refractions, moving with the careful dignity of someone who had never considered the possibility of losing. He'd configured his body for optimal combat form, extending blade-like protrusions at strategic points, hardening his exterior matrix to maximum density. The crowd offered polite acknowledgement. Velcrin was known, respected for his academic achievements, and several students from lower-class worlds wanted to see him succeed on principle. The human entered from the west entrance wearing the same gray bodysuit, her hair still in the same practical arrangement, and an expression that suggested she was attending something between a doctor's appointment and a mildly tedious committee meeting. She performed a few stretches, the kind of routine movement someone does to stay loose, and cracked her knuckles in a way that made crystalline students uncomfortable because the sound reminded them of structural failure. The crowd's reaction was more varied. Nervous excitement from the Deathworld students. Morbid curiosity from everyone else. One student from a Class 11 world started laughing and had to be removed. Head Administrative Rex, a molluscoid whose species regarded violence with the same distaste most people reserved for spoiled food, read the rules in the tone of someone who already regretted their life choices. Standard duration: 15 minutes or until submission. Standard restrictions: no weapons, no environmental manipulation, no lethal force. Standard legal protection: all participants absolve the Academy of responsibility for injuries sustained, up to and including permanent damage, because apparently that needed to be specified. Combatants ready? Vrex asked, already reaching for the medical alert system. Velcrin positioned himself in a classical Theshan combat stance that was considered elegant approximately 40,000 years ago, and hadn't improved since. The human stood normally, weight balanced, hands at her sides, looking like she was waiting for a transit shuttle. Ready? They said simultaneously. Begin, Vrex said, and immediately backed up several meters because survival instincts worked even for species that had supposedly evolved past them. Velcrin opened with a technique called the prismatic advance, which involved moving forward while rotating his crystalline structure to create disorienting light patterns. Against most opponents, it was effective. Against someone from a planet where the dominant predators hunted using camouflage, motion detection, and had literally evolved to track and kill things that didn't want to be tracked and killed, it was roughly equivalent to announcing your position with signal flares. The human sidestepped with minimal movement, letting Velcrin's blade protrusion pass through the space where she'd been standing 0.3 seconds ago. She didn't counterattack, just repositioned, watching. Velcrin adjusted, executing a technique that was very impressive to watch, involved significant rotation of his body mass, and committed him to a specific trajectory for approximately 1.2 seconds. For a creature from a Class 2 world, 1.2 seconds of commitment was tactically acceptable. For a creature from a Class 12 world, 1.2 seconds might as well be an engraved invitation. The human moved forward, inside Velcrin's rotation arc, and struck his central mass with a palm strike that would have been gentle by Deathworld standards. By crystalline standards, it was like being hit with a momentum transfer that his species' physics hadn't accounted for because nothing on their homeworld hit that hard, that fast, or with that much controlled precision. Velcrin's crystalline structure transmitted the impact through his entire body, creating harmonics that weren't supposed to happen. He stumbled backward, recalibrating, running combat algorithms that were suddenly producing error messages his ancestors had never encountered. You know, the human said conversationally, your stance is really designed for low-gravity environments. Your center of mass is all wrong for 0.95 standard. She demonstrated by sweeping his forward support position, which shouldn't have worked because he outweighed her significantly. Except it turned out that mass distribution mattered more than total mass, and she understood leverage in ways his species had never needed to learn. Velcrin hit the arena floor with a sound like wind chimes in a car accident. Several crystalline students flinched in sympathetic pain. He rolled to his feet with commendable speed, extended additional blade protrusions, and charged with enough momentum to seriously damage most opponents. The human dropped low, used his own momentum against him in a maneuver that looked simple until you calculated the timing required, and sent him sliding across the arena floor toward the north wall. She'd pulled the technique at the last second so he didn't actually hit the wall, which showed a restraint that nobody watching properly appreciated yet. The thing about Class 12 worlds, the human said, not even breathing hard, is that gravity is just the start. Earth has predators that hunt in packs using tactics. We have weather that tries to kill you. We have microorganisms that view your body as a convenient food source. We have plants that are poisonous, animals that are venomous, and geographical features that will absolutely murder you if you're not paying attention. Velcrin rose again, crystalline structure now showing hairline fractures that definitely hadn't been there at the start. He executed a technique that was supposed to be impossible to defend against because it attacked from multiple angles simultaneously. The human blocked all three angles with what looked like a basic defensive pattern but required processing speed and muscle memory that came from evolving in an environment where failure to defend meant you became part of the food chain. And you know what we developed in response to all of that. She continued, almost gentle now. Pattern recognition, spatial awareness, the ability to make threat assessments in microseconds. Strategic thinking, not because it's elegant, but because anything less gets you killed before you reproduce. She caught one of his blade protrusions, twisted in a way that leveraged his structural composition against itself, and locked his entire attack into a position where continued force would fracture his own arm. Velcrin froze. I'm not trying to humiliate you, the human said quietly enough that most of the crowd couldn't hear. But you need to understand something. You evolved for intelligence. That's great. That's genuinely impressive. But my species evolved for intelligence while being hunted by things that wanted to eat us, in an environment that wanted to kill us, while competing with other species that were also evolving intelligence to avoid being eaten. We got smart because smart was the only way to survive long enough to have children who might be smarter. She released his arm, stepped back, and dropped her defensive stance entirely. So please, she said, submit, because you're already at 7 visible fractures, and I really don't want to hurt you worse over something as stupid as academic pride. Velcrin's crystalline structure cycled through colors that his species associated with confusion, pain, dawning comprehension, and finally a resigned blue that meant acceptance. I submit, he said, his voice harmonics wavering. I acknowledge defeat. The crowd erupted in reactions that ranged from triumphant cheering to nervous relief to the sounds of currency and credits, changing hands across multiple betting pools. The human helped him to the medical station, because apparently after defeating someone in ritual combat, it was proper to ensure they received appropriate care. The medical staff, prepared for catastrophic injuries, found themselves instead treating pride damage and several fractures that would heal with standard crystalline restructuring therapy. Velcrin sat in the medical bay, his structure already beginning the slow process of repair, and watched the human explain something to one of the medical staff with the same patient clarity she'd used in the library. She caught him looking and gave a small nod that might have been respect or acknowledgement, or just, hey, we're cool now, right? I underestimated you, he said quietly. His translator rendered it with the appropriate tone of someone making a significant admission. Everyone does. She replied, it's practically a human tradition at this point. Your species is terrifying. Yeah, but we're trying to be better about it. She grinned, which showed teeth in a way that made several species uncomfortable. Civilization is a choice we make every day, not something we get because we evolved in a biodome. That's the whole point. Over the next several cycles, certain changes occurred at the academy. Velcrin relocated his seating to the opposite side of the lecture hall, not out of fear, but out of what he would later describe as tactical reassessment of personal positioning. His contributions to class discussions continued, but with a noticeable decrease in condescension and a surprising increase in questions that suggested genuine curiosity rather than rhetorical performance. The human's reputation spread through the academy like quantum entanglement, simultaneously affecting multiple social groups at once. Students from higher class worlds stopped treating her like a dangerous anomaly and started treating her like someone whose opinion about survival strategies might be worth hearing. Students from lower class worlds stopped assuming their comfortable evolution made them superior and started asking questions about the experiences that shaped different kinds of intelligence. The betting pools that had formed around the fight paid out according to the odds, with substantial winnings going to 3 students from Class 9 worlds who had put money on human victory under 5 minutes via educational humiliation. 1 student from a Class 11 world who had bet on both participants learned something valuable was informed that such philosophical outcomes didn't count for betting purposes, but the Academy's ethics board sent them a commendation anyway. Professor Collix reported the incident to the administration as required, noting in the official documentation that both students had followed proper protocols. No permanent injuries had occurred, and for the love of entropy, could they please update the combat arena regulations to account for species from different gravitational environments? Because the current rules were written by someone who apparently thought all students were basically the same size and shape. The administration filed the report under Incidents, Resolved, and moved on to dealing with 3 other crises that week, including a quantum chemistry experiment that had caused a localized time loop in Laboratory 7, a culinary club meeting that had somehow resulted in first contact with a previously unknown dimension populated by sentient flavor profiles, and a dormitory dispute about noise levels that had escalated to involve lawyers, therapists, and a priest from a religion that worshipped silence. Advanced Astrophysics 401 continued its semester with notably less tension and significantly more actual learning. The human, whose name the galaxy would eventually learn was Rena Vasquez, finished the course with top marks and a reputation for explaining complex mathematical concepts in ways that made sense even to students from species with completely different cognitive structures. She also developed a minor reputation for being willing to physically demonstrate gravitational principles using volunteer students as props, which was terrifying until you realized she could calculate the exact force required to illustrate a concept without causing injury, and found the whole thing hilarious. Velcrin of Thessia completed his degree with honors, published 4 more papers, and in his acceptance speech for the Novarin Prize in Theoretical Physics 3 years later, would thank a colleague who taught me that intelligence comes in many forms, shaped by many environments, and that true understanding requires acknowledging what we don't know as much as celebrating what we do. When asked to elaborate, he would simply say, "Never pick a fight with a Deathworlder unless you're prepared to learn exactly why their world is classified that way." But this is getting ahead of the timeline. 6 cycles after the incident in the arena, a new student arrived at the Celestial Nexus Academy. Thorix, the Magnificent, from the Zephyrian Dominion, stood 9 feet tall, possessed 4 arms, and came from a Class 3 world, where the most dangerous thing for the last 60,000 years had been intellectual debate about aesthetic philosophy. He had opinions about species from higher class worlds, opinions he was very willing to share, opinions that involved phrases like evolutionary regression and survival instinct compensation for inferior reasoning capacity. Advanced Astrophysics 501 met 3 times per standard cycle in the same lecture hall, taught by Professor Calix, who had aged approximately 10 years in the past 6 months and whose appendages now performed a nervous gesture whenever a new student entered the classroom. Thorix the Magnificent surveyed the available seating with all 4 eyes, noticed a human female sitting in the 3rd row, taking notes with the kind of focus that suggested she found the preliminary lecture interesting, and decided this was an excellent opportunity to establish social hierarchy early in the semester. He approached her desk with the confident stride of someone who had never lost an argument and certainly never lost a fight, because why would he have been in a fight? From the back row, Velcrin of Thessia made a sound like crystal harmonics in the specific frequency range, his species reserved for recognizing impending disaster. You there? Tharix announced, his voice carrying the natural resonance of someone accustomed to being heard. Primitive species representative. I am Tharix the Magnificent, and I feel it necessary to inform you that this is an advanced course requiring, oh no, Velcrin said quietly, cognitive capabilities that evolution in violent environments typically does not. Oh no no no. Velcrin was standing now, his crystalline structure shifting colors in alarm. Produce. And while I'm sure you try very hard, perhaps a more basic course would be appropriate for someone of your, Tharix the Magnificent. Velcrin's voice cut across the lecture hall, with the kind of volume that suggested panic. I formally advise you to stop talking immediately. Tharix turned with what looked like confusion. I'm merely establishing realistic expectations for, you're about to make the second worst decision of your life. Velcrin said rapidly. The worst decision would be continuing after I've warned you. The human looked up from her notes with an expression of mild interest. She glanced at Velcrin, back to Tharix, and then down at her datapad where she appeared to be calculating something. Colleague Velcrin, she said with careful politeness. Did you want to explain, or should I? I will explain, Velcrin said, moving down the aisle with surprising speed for a species that supposedly moved slowly. Tharix, this human student is Rena Vasquez from Earth, a Class 12 Deathworld. 6 cycles ago, I made assumptions similar to yours. I questioned her academic capabilities based on her evolutionary background. I implied that survival instincts were inferior to theoretical reasoning. And? Tharix asked, genuinely confused. And then I invoked academic challenge protocol, because I am an idiot who was born on a Class 2 world and had never experienced consequences. Rena's expression suggested she was trying not to laugh. He's being dramatic. I am being accurate, Velcrin corrected. I have 17 separate fracture scars in my crystalline matrix that are being accurate with me. Tharix looked between them, processing. You fought? In the arena? Fought is a generous term, Velcrin said. What actually happened was she provided a comprehensive practical demonstration of why Class 12 worlds produce their classification rating. It lasted 4 minutes. I tapped out before permanent damage occurred. I learned more about physics in those 4 minutes than in the previous 4 years of study, primarily lessons about momentum, leverage, and why gravitational adaptation matters more than I thought. Professor Collix entered the lecture hall, saw Tharix standing at Rena's desk, saw Velcrin's alarmed posture, and immediately reached for the formal incident report datapad they now kept readily accessible. Is there a problem? Collix asked in the tone of someone who already knew the answer and was preemptively exhausted about it. No problem, Rena said easily. She looked up at Tharix with a pleasant smile that absolutely did not reach her eyes. The Magnificent here was just about to apologize for the interrupted introduction, sit down in an available seat ideally several rows away, and we were all going to have a nice, quiet, educational semester, where nobody questions anybody else's academic capabilities based on planetary classification. Right? Tharix possessed enough intelligence to recognize when a situation had shifted from theoretical to extremely practical. He also possessed enough pattern recognition to notice that several other students, particularly ones from higher class worlds, were watching him with expressions that suggested they knew something he didn't and were curious whether he would learn it the easy way or the interesting way. Right, he said slowly. My apologies for any presumption. I will find appropriate seating. Excellent choice, Velcrin said with feeling. Welcome to Advanced Astrophysics 501. The mathematics is challenging. The professor is excellent. And please never make assumptions about cognitive capacity based on environmental classification, because you will learn exactly why those assumptions are wrong, and the tuition is expensive enough without adding medical bills. Tharix the Magnificent selected a seat in the back row, suddenly much less magnificent and significantly more thoughtful. Rena returned to her notes as if nothing had happened, because for her, nothing particularly unusual had happened. This was just another cycle at the academy. Professor Calix put away the incident report datapad with visible relief and began the lecture on advanced quantum field interactions. grateful that this semester might, possibly, potentially, hopefully involve more physics and less physical conflict. In the back row, Velkrin settled into his seat and allowed his crystalline structure to shift through colors that indicated satisfaction. He'd paid forward the lesson he'd learned, saved another student from making his mistakes, and would probably tell this story at academic conferences for the rest of his life as a cautionary tale about the dangers of intellectual pride. In the third row, Rena Vasquez took detailed notes on quantum field theory, occasionally solving problems 3 steps ahead of the lecture, and thought about what she might have for dinner because the Academy's cafeteria was featuring Rigelian cuisine tonight and she'd heard good things about their plasma-grilled vegetables. And in the administrative offices 17 levels above the lecture halls, the Dean of Students reviewed the semester's enrollment numbers and noticed with some concern that advanced astrophysics courses were experiencing unusually high transfer request rates from students on lower-class worlds, all of them specifically requesting placement in any